So, continuing on, American Lit, 1945 to the present, part 3. Again, the literary field is diversifying. Um, and it's not so much that these writers weren't around in the past, it's just that there is a greater readership and a more diverse publishing industry willing to put more representative and broad literary voices into the marketplace. So it's a very exciting time. Jewish American writers continue to be on the rise. I mean, we've seen them from the very beginning of American literature, but they continue on, especially with writers such as Saul Bellow and Philip Roth. The Native American Renaissance is also really important during this period, and there are lots of fantastic names in this field as well. Asian American writers, Latinx writers, and also LGBT writers. So what we see here is a very, very new literary landscape, and if you look at this very last volume of the Norton, and this is volume E of the second set, which is all we're using for 75B, you'll notice this great diversity. And there are even in the instructor's notes different ways you can build a syllabus based on whether you want it to be chronological or whether you want to make it a course about minority writers or women writers, etc., and so on. So there's so many ways to organize this course, and I probably told you this before, but I agonize about it a little bit because it's kind of like being at this really good buffet, not like one of those ones you get sick at. Like in Vegas, everything looks so good, but there's only so much you can put on your tray. And if you're me, like there's only so much I can put on my tray that I know I can eat. I mean, I feel really guilty about throwing away food. That's probably because I'm half Sicilian too, and throwing away food is like throwing away your mother's and your grandmother's love. So I got that going on too. But enough about my psychoanalysis session. Let's move on. So another very big, important aesthetic and literary and cultural change is from the literary movement of modernism to postmodernism. And what we do see after World War II are certain kinds of fields of thought or of art that put post in front of it. You may have also heard of post-structuralism in, say, philosophy. It's become a bit of a trend, and some of these phrases, some of these movements are better defined and more relevant than others, but we'll just stick to literary postmodernism to try to keep it as simple as possible. So, what is it? Well, I don't know why I put that there because I was going to answer it. There are all kinds of different aesthetic or artistic movements that take place after World War II, starting in the 50s, and going through this current moment we are right now. There's another large movement that is taking over. I don't think it's been named yet. Sometimes these names come much later, or at least in the middle of a said movement. So in some ways it's an engagement with and a conversation with modernism. Both the aesthetics, then in other words, what is considered good art according to modernism, and also the philosophy of modernism. We talked a little bit about that too. Now, some kinds of postmodernism is a rejection of modernism. In other words, it's pushing back against some of like the more challenging or unpalatable aspects of modernism. Anti-Semitism is a facet in quite a bit of modernist art and literature. But it could also be about what is considered aesthetically good in modernism. Some people see it as a continuation of the unfinished project of modernism. In other words, it's modernism progressing, if you want to use that term. Some people see it as a reflection that is self-critical upon modernism. In other words, it's modernism looking in upon itself, and that's a very meta definition of it. What's important for you to think about in terms of modernism is that some people see it as an extension, some see it as a mutation, some people see it as a refutation or a challenge to modernism. And all you got to do is think about any one aspect of modernism. Somebody's either going further with it, somebody's either reflecting upon it, some people are rejecting it and returning or going somewhere else. And if we think about some of the elements of modernism in literature, the idea of the fragment, the idea of ambiguity, polyvocalism, all of those things can be either taken further or turned back. One of the things that I will say seems to be fairly prevalent in postmodernism is continuing challenge of narrative structure. In some places, things that are considered novels really just kind of crumble away from that very traditional Western structure we know, which is exposition, rising tension, climax, decreasing tension, resolution or denouement. Some postmodernist novels or stories completely do away with that and either repeat elements or mix them all up or put in a high degree of arbitrariness into them. Some postmodernist works fold in upon themselves and are constantly deconstructing themselves in a way that leaves the reader completely disoriented. Some are looking to keep logic or Western logical thinking, sometimes known as logocentrism by postmodernists and poststructuralists, out of their work. We're not going to go so far down that postmodernist hole because I still feel like there's so much to talk about without wringing our hands too much about this movement. There's still really, in some ways, lacking in strong definitions. And some people say, well, that's what it is. You know, postmodernism defies all definitions and stuff like that. But I feel like that's a little too easy. Anyway, so what do we need to know about postmodern fiction? I'm sure I'm repeating myself now. So it's moving away from sociological realism and psychological realism. And we saw these things like 19th century realism. We could say with Bierce and Twain in like Huckleberry Finn. I think we could also put Dreiser in there with his sister Carrie, even though more strictly speaking, Dreiser is, a naturalist. Stephen Crane and some of his work like Red Badge of Courage, or The Open Boat, and 20th century psychological realism, that really inward-looking turn that we see in some 20th century narratives. These are things postmodern fiction pushes back against. And here, history and fiction continue to be kind of eroded away from these very unassailable pillars that they used to be on in the past. Maybe pedestal is a better word there. In other words, history and fiction are seen as kinds of subjective narratives or manifestations of a person and their experience. And even further, some people will say, like, there's a very famous post-structural essay called The Death of the Author, that a work of art, even a work of literature, is really just the confluence of sociological forces within the person. And the idea of agency, of being in charge of work of art, is a silly fantasy that doesn't really work. Anyway, this is all very theoretical, as you can imagine. And it also does challenge how well literature, or really any art form, can represent reality. How well can words really show us what really exists? Is reality in any way, at any level, knowable in and of itself without language? In other words, whatever's out there has to be filtered through our senses and our sense of language. And in other words, language, as some people would say, I believe it was Nietzsche who said it, was language is kind of a prison house. And postmodern fiction also looks in a very self-reflexive way at language itself, what language can do, what language cannot do. So you might find a lot of wordplay in it that, again, might sometimes be really fun and exciting, but can also be really, really challenging and will defy very conventional attempts for you to get meaning out of it. I think James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is a great example of this. Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow also works in this way as well. And those tend to be two really strong examples. Postmodern poetry also does things a bit differently. Oh, why didn't I have the little fade in on this? I'm going to have to fix that. So instead of a poem being an artifact or a product, a lot of times in postmodern poetry, it's seen as a process. It's something that hasn't really ended. In other words, it's part of a stream of notions or ideas or social forces that are coming together. But just as meaning never ends and is never final, the poem never is either. There's also an increasing emphasis on on the unconscious, as we know in like the Freudian term and the psychoanalytic term, those thoughts and desires and drives that are buried beneath the surface. Accident and chance, things like found poems, are really important at this point. If you've never been to the Found website, where people basically take photos of notes that they found or pictures they found, that's part of a postmodern project in a way. And chance too. Some poets will take words and phrases and just randomly put them together after tossing them in the air, in order to create a sense of structure that is outside or farther outside of human will. And also there's a growing focus on the body, how the body gets represented in poetry, including sexuality, gender, women's experiences, and anything related to either selfing and othering of gender, sexuality, experience, and that relationship to society. And there's also that greater sense of personal life reflected in poetry. And we see some of that as the confessional poetry project moving forward. Sometimes it's just really mundane, everyday stuff. And sometimes the stuff's really interesting. Sometimes it may not float your boat. And we're running low on time. I'll do John Cheever in the next video. Thanks for watching.